Welcome to the Culture, Faith, and Politics podcast. I'm Pat Kahnke, and I'm really happy to be joined again today by Pastor Dave Johnson. He was the former pastor of Church of the Open Door in Minneapolis, and now he's the head of a ministry for pastors and church leaders called Things That Remain. And you're in Arizona now, Dave, is that right?
I am.
Yeah.
I am. And it's weirdly hot here. It's still March, right?
Yeah,
they're
it is. Yeah.
98 degrees. My car said 107 degrees. I took a picture of it.
Wow.
And I'm not used to that, but it's a dry heat.
Okay. Yeah. Well, today I think we're going to have everything from, we had thunder and lightning last night, and we'll probably get snow at some point today. So it's, and it was like, I think 70 yesterday. So it's just typical Minnesota stuff we're going through here.
Right.
Yeah. So we're continuing with our discussion today of Matthew Taylor's amazing book, his disturbing book, The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian movement that's threatening our democracy. And today we're talking about chapter 3, which is called Generals of Spiritual Warfare. And even me saying that, I already feel like choking on that sentence. But Generals of Spiritual Warfare. This is a banger. So we're going to get into this. So as always, I recommend that you read the book because Dave and I are both big time attention deficit survivors, and we're gonna leave tons of things out. The way that we look at these books that we talk about is sort of as a jumping off point for our conversations, but our conversations aren't meant to replace reading the books because there's so much in these books. So what we do is a little bit more like a couple of friends that you might get to be a fly on the wall, just listening to us process this stuff. So Dave, I thought that this chapter ended with probably the most important quote from the book, although there's a lot of important quotes, but I'm going to read, this is how the chapter ends. So this is where we're going in this chapter. He ends it by, go ahead.
So you know we're on the same page. It's page 109. I didn't know you were going to talk about this, but what you're about to read is...
Yeah, and I've got it on my Kindle, so I don't even know what page it is, but yeah. So this is the quote. If your political opponents are literally inspired by demons, then there's no negotiating with them. Demons are not meant to be negotiated with. They're meant to be battled, exercised, and expelled. As we saw on January 6th, this rhetoric of spiritual violence stokes real-world violence. You can only proclaim that a group of people or a political party is filled with demons for so long before someone decides that those demonic vessels must actually be physically attacked. I just thought that was a chilling and very real statement. And so that's where this chapter is going. And so we're going to be talking about how you get from this, for instance, the Cindy Jacobs that the chapter starts with, who's just like, if you saw her walking on the street, you'd probably just think, well, there's just, maybe a little bit wild-eyed look in her eyes if you look closely, but otherwise just this, unassuming person. You get from her.
Like grandma. She looks like your grandma. There's nothing, crazy.
Right. Yeah. Right. Well, there's something in the eyes, though. You got to admit, I watched her for a few seconds on YouTube, and I was like, no, there's something in the eyes, but you've seen it. But anyway, so now I am hoping, Dave, that you'll do most of the talking today, but I do want to start with some thoughts that I wrote down here on a broader question that people often ask me about this kind of stuff. And so we're going to be talking today about some people who call themselves prophets and, prophets and apostles, but prophets like with some kind of spiritual power. And you might be asking, and it'd be understandable to ask, well, what if they really are? What if Cindy Jacobs, for instance, who we're going to be talking about, is like the real deal? How do we know? So I want to start with a simple truth that I think we should just always keep in mind when we listen to people like this. Some of these people, like Cindy Jacobs, have supposedly, and I'm leaving this as supposedly is doing a lot of work in this sense for me, but they've supposedly exhibited supernatural gifts of knowledge and prophecy. And I personally tend to distrust anyone who operates in these gifts in like a public manner. Where they're getting attention from the use of these gifts, or they're mobilizing, thousands or millions of people based on some supposed word that they're hearing. So I tend to distrust them automatically, but I might be overly skeptical. So here's what I know to be true. And Dave, you can check me on this. This is how I think about this. Is in Matthew 7, Jesus said, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they're ravenous wolves. You'll know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you'll know them." And so here's my deal with this. Like, these people are currently and have been for years vocal, powerful supporters of Donald Trump. And many of them participated in that rally at the Capitol on January 6th that turned into the insurrection. They were actively involved in the planning of that sort of thing, and they were praying for it. They were speaking, they were inviting people, they were live streaming it, and that's inexcusable. And for me, that's all the proof that I need that even if they might have some kind of supernatural gifts, which is a scary thought, these are wolves. And so what I know is somebody's going to hear me say that, and they're going to say, well, that's circular reasoning. Because people are going to say, well, these prophets are telling us that Trump is God's man for America. You don't like Trump, so you reject them as prophets. And therefore, Trump isn't God's man for America, but that's circular reasoning, they'll say. And so my response, I think this is important just for setting the stage, is that I don't have to listen to a prophet to tell me whether or not Trump is God's man for America. I've got all the entire Bible. I've got everything Donald Trump has done and said in his life. I don't need a prophet. If a prophet is trying to overrule my basic sense of moral intelligence, then that prophet, I'm not going to listen to that prophet. And so that's where I'm going with this. And so I don't care if they have the power to tell me you've got exactly $2,324 in your checking account right now, Pat, and that you dreamed about blue herons gliding over a swamp last night. I don't care if they can tell me that. They're a false prophet because they're leading people away from Jesus. So that's my bit. So I just want to hear, what do you think of that? Am I on track? Am I missing some things? How do you think about this?
Well, no, I think you're on track. But I don't automatically dismiss the prophetic. I don't think you do either.
No. I just miss doing it on a large scale. I just miss doing it and projecting it out into the world.
Right. Yeah. And one of the, my mind goes in a bunch of different ways. You indicated that we were ADD, so I see several squirrels all at the same time. But one of them about when you read that thing from Matthew 7, the false prophets, by your fruits you'll know them. What are we talking about? Is that character? Is that what are the fruits we're looking for that would indicate truth? Well, they would have to do prophecies that are true, for one thing. But the other thing is, when I did that book on spiritual abuse back in the late 80s, The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse, my piece in that book was Matthew 23 and the characteristics of a false teacher. Now, he's talking about the Pharisees. Well, one of them was they would assume, they would take for themselves authority that didn't belong to them. They seat themselves. It says, I think it's Matthew 23 verse 1 or 2. They seat themselves in the chair of Moses. What the heck is that? Well, the chair of Moses is the seat of authority. And if Moses says it, that's true. And now the prophets aren't using this kind of language, but it occurred to me when you quoted Matthew 7 that that's one of the things. They're claiming this authority that they're hearing directly from God. These are not people who are humbly saying, I have this sense that maybe the issue here is this, and I don't know if it's God or not, so let's discern this together. They're declaring the word of the Lord. And one of the things that's interesting, you said you watched some things of Cindy Jacob on YouTube and stuff. So did I.
I watched about 30 seconds, and I couldn't take it. She was just getting warmed up, and I was like, no, I've seen enough.
People, and I've seen it before. So
right.
when I was watching, I'm going, honestly, my thing, Pat, was like, how do people buy this?
Right.
Like, where does this person become, according to Matthew Taylor? And I think this is an incredible book, by the way. He's done.
Oh, it is. Yeah, it is.
Yeah. How do people buy this? And there are people who do. So it helped me. I was telling you before we even got online here, to create some context. This is weird because I was listening to another podcast by Mike Cosper. Some of you might know that name. He's the guy from CT's Christianity Today podcast that did the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. Yeah. But he's doing a new one that kind of caught my attention. I've kind of been leisurely listening to it when I get a chance, called The Devil in the Deep Blue Sea.
Okay.
And one of the things he did, I can't remember which episode this was, but he was dealing with what he called the satanic panic. Now, this is going to create some context, okay?
Yeah.
For where do people like Cindy Jacobs come from?
From like the late 70s, early 80s?
Yeah, it was late 70s, the early 80s into the late 80s, actually. Some of you, if you went to my church, I mean, we knew about Frank Peretti and, This Present Darkness. Right. And I'm not saying it's evil or you can't read that book, but that was in the air. There were things going on in the 70s and the 80s. It was a fascinating time historically. This is all set in context that kind of helps me understand how could we or people buy into this Cindy Jacobs thing.
Because she comes right out of that time. She comes right out of that. Yeah, this chapter is kind of grounded.
Started there, and all of a sudden, yeah, if I have this authority, then maybe if that's true, then maybe that's true. But let me just kind of finish that train of thought. If you go back in your mind, and some of you aren't old enough to do this, but I am, and you are, Pat, the Jesus People movement was happening. Amazing thing. People, the hippies were all coming to Jesus. The flower power stuff it was wonderful and weird and wacky and wonderful. It's identified by, now Cosper identifies that season as being theologically innovative and experimental. So you would just experiment with things, and we'll try to pray it this way and we'll say it that way. And a lot of experimental, a lot of freedom, breaking away from the confinements of religion and stuff, which I applaud. That's wonderful. Right. It feels good to do that. And there was some good stuff about that season. There was an awakening of supernatural power and spiritual reality. There was an awareness of spiritual gifts. Even, I mean, we've talked in previous episodes that I was profoundly affected by John Wimber, and kind of opened my mind and my heart and my soul to the reality of the gifts of the Spirit are for today. And so that was a season where a lot of these things were happening. And with that came this awareness of, and there was language that got developed around spiritual warfare. And new and novel phrases grew up. And they're kind of biblical, they're scripturally adjacent.
Yeah,
these aren't
exactly.
Words, okay? Yeah, they're not words in the Bible, but they're things. So we started talking about praying a hedge of protection over people. Not saying you shouldn't do that, but that's just a thing. That's part of our language. This people would talk about, okay, if you were afraid and you struggled with fear, you had a spirit of fear. Wait a minute, like it wasn't just fear that I needed to deal with. You have a spirit of fear that's a demonic oppression relative to fear. We talked about a spirit of poverty. There was the spirit of control. And then there was the ever encouraging the spirit of Jezebel. And that was one, I heard that one thrown around all the time. Anytime, particularly a woman would, try to say something that was whatever they got.
I can't tell you how many times Kamala Harris got tarred with that phrase, on just a lot of the conversations that I saw online and stuff. And it's just like any woman who tries to seek power that these people don't agree with has the spirit of Jezebel, and it's pretty disgusting.
It is pretty disgusting. It's not only stupid, it's stupid. Like it's abusive, but it's a way for me. That goes back to the thing you said that you read from the book. There's no negotiating. There's no conversation. There's no trying to understand these people. We just paint them with this white brush. White, I don't know if it's white. A broad brush. spirit of Jezebel. So be afraid. It's a tactic. It's if demonic power is on something, it might be on that.
Right.
When you just use that phrase and say to be afraid of that and demonize people who are opponents and the liberal left, I am not for them. But I'm like demonizing them.
Right.
Anyway, but the progression. Let me get back to that. This progression of what makes sense. There's this language, and I love that when Casper was saying this because by the way, I'm listening to the podcast, and all of a sudden Matthew Taylor comes on. He's starting to talk to Matthew Taylor on this other podcast, so it kind of blended into this.
Who wrote the book that we're talking about?
Exactly, right. Yeah. But the part of the language too. I remember we were talking about taking prayer walks. We did that, praying over the neighborhood. That's a good thing. Territorial spirits. Okay. I don't know, maybe.
But like right there, for instance, I'd say if at best, I'm not an expert on demonology. I'm not. I've never aspired to that. I watched The Exorcist once, I watched The Omen, but I'm not an expert. But
can I pause right there? Right,
yeah.
I don't want you to lose your thought. But Casper talks about The Exorcist. And that the guy who wrote it, Friedkin, I can't remember his name, the guy who produced it, did not want it to be a horror movie. He wanted it to be an examination of faith.
Oh, interesting.
And that movie, it was in this season that I'm trying to describe. And it stirred up, he talked about a huge uptake of people in Catholicism asking for deliverance. Even in the evangelical world, we became more aware of, and so this language was all part of that. I'm sorry.
No, that's good. Like I said that jokingly, I was being sarcastic, but there's some truth to it because I was raised Catholic. So I watched The Omen as a kid, and it scared the daylights out of me. And I actually went through a period of like 25 years where I didn't watch any movies as an adult about demons and stuff like that, because it was touching on something very primal inside of me. That but so anyway, so the point is I'm not an expert on any of this, but when you talked about territorial spirits, for instance, my sense of it is that's another one of those biblically adjacent type thoughts, like this whole structure that Cindy Jacobs, that you'll talk about, I'm sure in a minute, came up with about, the hierarchy of the spirits over the different countries. And it's like to me, it's like they're playing Dungeons and Dragons and putting some Christian words on it, but we don't know that this is how we don't know any of this. Right. This is some people with powerful imaginations who are taking some biblical texts and they're building an entire cosmology out of it that they've got no way of proving, and then they're mobilizing a movement around it. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. One of the things that I have, and I'm not sure we agree on this, we'd have to keep talking, but I think they believe it.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I think they do believe it. I think they're sincere. And I've been in that environment. I can see how it happens. This is getting me back to context. Like, where does Cindy Jacobs come from? People like her, and how do people get pulled into that kind of thing? Here's a great quote, I thought, by Casper, that he called this season in the Satanic Panic back in the 70s, 80s. And Cindy Jacobs kind of appeared on the scene around 1989. I'll get to that in a second. But this is a quote from him. It was a cauldron of ideas. The environment in the culture and in the church was a cauldron of ideas, politically and spiritually, that was amorphous, meaning kind of a blob. You can't really put your finger on it and identify it, but it was growing rapidly. So there's this amorphous, not sure what it is, that's growing rapidly in one direction, he said, toward Republican politics and conservatism. And in the 70s and 80s, there was not a whiff of that.
Yeah.
Not a whiff of that. Interesting. We're going to pray over you. We're going to bind the demons. We're going to, okay, let's do that. yeah, and then it's weird because we talked about Peter Wagner last episode. Let me see if I have this here. Yeah, I don't. Anyway, but it was in 19. Can I talk a bit about Wagner and how this fits? Because it does, I think, help explain how do we get here. Because I think watching Wagner in his journey might be an example of how people get there. So here's Peter Wagner. Talked about him in the last episode. He was chapter 2 or no, Paula White was 2. Wagner was 1. Anyway, he's this professor. Even his picture, he looks professorial. He's got these dorky glasses and this little goofy thing like me. But he looks very like a professor, and he didn't believe in the gifts when he started. He was a missionary in Bolivia, and what his original contribution was to church growth. You and I talked about this. He was the church growth guy when we were in seminary. I mean, I was earlier than you, but but then that church growth thing that incorporated social sciences to how do we evangelize the culture. Where you struggled was that everyone's the homogenous thing.
And
it really was his church growth thing took off in suburbs where people are all the same. So let's have churches that cater to that. The seeker sensitive thing came out of that. I read recently Rick Warren, who I have a lot of respect for, did Saddleback Church, but he did his doctoral dissertation on church growth under Peter Wagner. Got it.
He was applying those principles.
And what that does is it indicates this was credible. Okay. There are people who were credible and part of the kingdom of God and cared about growing the church. Peter Wagner was one of them. And then he met John Wimber, which opened. So there's the church growth thing. Peter Wagner was already known for that. Peter Wagner meets John Wimber. We talked about this in another episode. And through that experience with John Wimber, he opened up to the gifts of the Spirit. And it was a major thing. And so Peter Wagner and John Wimber were doing some things together at the Fuller Seminary, and they were connected. And but Peter Wagner, in my mind, and I said this last time, I think he had a good spirit. I really do. But he was a guy who, if that works, I'm going to do it. If that works, we're going to do it. If that works, we're going to do it. So all of a sudden he saw what he discerned to be, and I agree with him, what was coming out of Wimber being authentic expressions of supernatural workings of the Spirit, and said, this will help the church grow. And then they had a falling out. And when Cindy Jacobs came in there somewhere, I'm maybe not getting the timeline exactly right, but it was around.
This gets us into chapter 3 because it does. Chapter 3 starts with Cindy Jacobs.
Yep. Okay, so we're up to speed then, because then he met Cindy Jacobs, and Cindy Jacobs was like taking the John Wimber stuff. I'm not going to say it was on steroids, but she went way beyond what Wimber was doing, and this is where they kind of parted ways. And one of the big significant things was not only the gifts of the Spirit for healing and insight and discernment, but for spiritual warfare. And if there really are territorial, Cindy Jacobs had this interpretation of the Great Commission. Go into all the world, teach the gospel, making disciples of all nations. And if the gospel needs to go to all nations, what if one of the problems of the nations responding to the gospel is that there are territorial spirits over not just people, individuals, but nations? And so that gave birth. Okay, do you see the progression? What I'm trying to appeal to is, even if I'm not saying it well, it didn't start out where it is now. There was a progression and this profound belief in a paradigm that says there are territorial spirits over nations, and we are going to war against them. And so now you've got this cosmic conflict between good, evil, angels, demons, and the Jericho mark. Go to January 6th. January 6th was, in their minds, a cosmic conflict against evil, against demons. The Democrats are the devil. And it became bizarre.
Right. And there's one piece that I think I would add into this that kind of brings all of it together. And I'm trying to find it here in the book. but it's basically the way that Matthew Taylor writes about Cindy Jacobs. He says that I'm sort of I'm paraphrasing, so I can't find it here, but what he talks about is that she also reframed the Great Commission, so that to me this is the key to what takes them from merely the spiritual warfare. We're doing battle in the heavenlies over these territorial spirits over this country and this country. It takes it from just that into the political realm. The way that she framed up the Great Commission was, and this is what you hear now in all of these Christian nationalists, is that we are making disciples means actually making people live by the commands of God. And so it's not, it's, you know, instead of making disciples that like most people historically would say, hey, we're sharing the gospel with people and then they follow Jesus if they want to. This is like taking a nation and making that nation obey the commands of God. And that was a frame that she uses in the way that she looks at the Great Commission. And to me, that's deadly. And that's what we see in also. So there's this NAR movement. There's also the whole movement out of Moscow, Idaho. And they have very different theologies in some way, but they share that. That what Christians, to make disciples of the nations means to make the nations obey the commands of God.
Yeah, bring them all under that
thing. Yeah. So
and
I just wanted to add that, and then you take that basic belief and you add in this whole spiritual warfare realm, like we're doing this in the heavenlies,
right?
But then it kind of comes into the actual flesh and blood world on January 6th.
Yep. And I think too that it, and I've said this already, but when you add that component of, instead of, like, I really disagree with the direction these people are going, they didn't start thinking this way, but all of a sudden my opponent is demonically empowered.
Right.
And that does trigger me to say again, I think we said it earlier, even in this episode, I wonder if they're ever going to have a time when they realize that maybe some of what's being affected by dark power is some of what they're doing.
Right.
And I can't imagine them being able to let that in. I would pray for them if they ever see that, because they're going to need grace. Because I think the spiritual warfare rhetoric, if you just keep it to a, there's an enemy and and it's individual and stuff like that, I think spiritual warfare is real. I don't want to blow that away. I think we need to be aware. The enemy is like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. What if he's devouring you?
Right.
Cindy?
Right. And
given divine sanction to a multiple felon who I do think that, one of the things she said was that Donald Trump came into power by supernatural sources.
Right.
What else would explain this guy who's a moral reprobate? I mean, this is Cindy Jacobs talking.
Right.
And I'm not sure she's wrong. It was maybe supernatural power, not God's. Not God's.
Right.
Maybe.
Right. Yep. And I think, do you want to step through this chapter section by section for a second, now that we've kind of laid the groundwork? I mean, again, the chapter is called Generals of Spiritual Warfare. I'm looking at it here, and I'm sorry. If I come across disrespectful, I'm sorry if I don't come across disrespectful enough. I think sometimes I show too much respect to some of these ideas. The people themselves, I'm not trying to be disrespectful to the people, but the ideas just have to be, they have to be countered. I think they have to be mocked too. So anyway,
the thing about the generals, though, I want you to keep your thought. But
no, I have no more thoughts. I was venting my spleen. So you can tell me, what are these generals? What are these generals of spiritual warfare? That's the name of the chapter.
The first thing I notice is this: there really is this military kind of language around it, generals, warfare, all that kind of stuff. But to give her the benefit of the doubt and put it in the context where, okay, I get that. What the generals of warfare were, she was trying to gather people of like mind, who, again, in this NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation, they had gone. They had. This is another thing that happened in the season of Jesus people and all that. There was this affirmation of the five. What's it called?
Fivefold ministry.
Thank you, fivefold ministry. And among the five expressions of ministry were prophets and apostles. And so their biblical, basis of that was that there is apostolic authority now, there is prophetic authority now, and there are prophets and apostles now. And so her generals were people in her circle who they identified. She wasn't running the whole show, but they identified themselves. And Peter Wagner ultimately did identify himself as a kind of apostle as well.
Yeah, she talked him into that.
So they would gather together, have these prayer conferences once a year. There was a big thing. I don't remember the name of you'd have to read the book for this.
Yeah.
But they would once a year have all these apostles and prophets gather, and they would share what they're hearing from God. And so I understand that. Okay, you would find people who are of like mind, and what are you hearing? What are you seeing? What are you sensing? But it just really did become this, and it moves into what we'll talk about in the next couple of sessions when we talk about the dominion theology and the five, there were the
seven mountains. Yep.
Yeah.
So the book, the chapter starts, by laying out her history, and that's interesting. You can see, you can see where she came from, and it's interesting. Then she meets some of these people, and like in Kansas City, the Kansas City prophets were, they were influential. And then the chapter talks about Dutch Sheets, who's going to figure all through the rest of the book. So it kind of introduces Dutch Sheets as a character, and Dutch Sheets and Cindy Jacobs, it sounds like, have just been kind of in some ways tied at the hip ever since, kind of the early days of her movement. So
I'll clarify one thing too. The Kansas City prophets. There are people who may or may not know what they are, but I do. I didn't read in the book. That was Mike Bickle, Trinity IHOP. My kids, actually, two of my girls went to their master's commission, which was wonderful, I think. But the Kansas City prophets were pretty well known, late 80s, early 90s, Paul Cain. A lot of it was debunked, but there was something. So yes.
Yeah. And then a lot of it went, there's really dark stuff that we've talked about in previous episodes about Mike Bickle and where some of these people went. So, so she got involved in all of that. And, but then she and her husband founded, it says in 1985, a new organization called Generals of Intercession. And, like you said a minute ago, that you didn't remember the name of some particular conference or group. There's all these names of conferences and groups, and just every one of them, whatever it is a little bit self-exalting and a little bit like, okay, come on, so anyway, these are the Generals of Intercession. And so they were training people in the area of prayer and spiritual warfare. And then she like we've talked about, at some point she met C. Peter Wagner. Yeah. And that was really where a lot of this stuff came together. And there's a section in this chapter called Spiritual Fathers and Daughters. Yeah. And so do you want to talk about sort of how that spiritual fathers and daughters thing works, and how, the relationship between Peter Wagner, who we talked about last time, and
well, I don't know how it works for them. I mean, I think that you would call someone your spiritual father who was maybe mentoring you. I think that's a true thing. I think, Pat, you have spiritual sons and daughters. Some of them you don't even know, just because you planted the seed of God's truth into them through your preaching and teaching. And so the spiritual fathers and daughters is great. But what's happened here is that, and I'm not even like big down on that at all, although unless it gets manipulative and it's a power thing, like the father's over the and I tell you what to do, which
Yeah,
does happen
that's
in
right. In these groups. Yeah.
Yeah. But I just think there's a sense of, I love her, this, and it's healthy. She's my daughter. It's not
right.
this thing. What I was going to say though about when Wagner met Cindy Jacobs, I think I said something like this earlier. It took Peter Wagner further than he had been with John Wimber relative to the spiritual gifts and things like that. And so you combine two things: the church growth movement, Peter Wagner, charismatic renewal, John Wimber. Cindy Jacobs comes under that, or after that, late 80s. And again, she's more out there than Wimber was. And Wagner went kind of, I don't know, in some ways he followed her.
Right.
Like this whole thing of territorial spirits was new to him, but he bought in. Again, the spirit of Peter Wagner is, if it works, if it could help us evangelize the world, and there really are territorial spirits over nations, and there are ways to pray against that, let's do it.
Yeah, pragmatic.
Well intended, I think. But wow, where it goes is weird. You want to tell them the story about the Mount Everest?
Yeah, why don't you tell them that story? Because I read it, but I think you're a better storyteller than I am. Because you give them a little bit, you bring some humanity to it, where I am just so irritated with these people. I'm just mean. Yeah. So, yeah.
I know you're not. Anyway, well, actually, Taylor, the author of the book we're reading, uses as an example of something that kind of went awry relative to identifying territorial spirits. Now, territorial spirits, and this again gradually happen. You can almost imagine in conversations where you're prophetic, you see demons, and all of a sudden it's not just people, it's over nations. And what somebody got a word, it was a woman, the name is, I could find it, read the book, who got a word, and it was affirmed by these prophets that there was a territorial spirit called the Queen of Heaven. And it was at the highest level of power or something like that in the world. And one of the major tenets of spiritual warfare over territorial spirits was boots on the ground. By the way, that's why they were in January 6th. Boots on the ground. There's where the conflict is. We need to be there to pray there.
Right.
And the highest place in the world that they could think of, true story, it was Mount Everest. So they actually gathered some people, I don't know, 40, something like that. They made an expedition to Mount Everest, and I don't know how far they climbed, but they went there, boots on the ground, to pray against the territorial spirit of the Queen of Heaven. It was called Ice Castle.
Operation Ice Castle.
Operation.
I'm telling you, this is Dungeons and Dragons with a Christian face. This is all we're doing here. But anyway, keep going.
Well, what Taylor said later when she, and by this time there was a gal named Becca. I shouldn't have brought her name up because I can't remember her name.
Yeah, I've got it here. I'll tell you in a minute.
Okay, tell me in a minute.
Yeah.
But later when she was asked years later.
Becca Greenwood. Becca Greenwood, yeah.
Asked years later about that fiasco, because here's one question. They go and they pray against the Queen of Heaven on Mount Everest. How do you know it's gone?
Right. So I'll just read this part here, because this kind of paints a picture. Matthew Taylor writes this. So in September 1997, Wagner helped organize a team of 26 prophetic intercessors and spiritual warriors from all these countries to be boots on the ground, like you said, confronting the Queen of Heaven. Doris Wagner, who's very respected in these spiritual warfare circles, even traveled with the group. Accompanying her was a promising young American spiritual warrior named Becca Greenwood, who was only 30 years old at the time. So Doris was suffering from severe arthritis. So she stayed at a hotel at 13,000 feet, while the rest of them went up to 20,000 feet to locate the spiritual castle of the Queen of Heaven. So they spent 3 weeks in Nepal blowing shofars. And by the way, you know that shofar is a trigger word for me. So we can talk in a different video all about.
I just thought it meant, shofar, show good. I don't know. Right?
So I've had experiences with the shofar. Anyway, so they spent 3 weeks in Nepal blowing shofars, prophesying and interceding against the territorial spirits. And And then Wagner published an entire booklet about it later called Confronting the Queen of Heaven. And Ana Mendez made a documentary with footage from the trip. So yeah, I'm guessing, I haven't watched this documentary. I'm guessing they don't actually have footage of the Queen of Heaven. Just my guess.
Are you being sarcastic?
Yes, I'm being sarcastic.
Well, that is what I mean. I haven't read that book by Wagner, but it's like, so what did that make a difference in the world? Like,
right.
The Queen of Heaven's gone. So how did that affect the spread of the gospel in the world?
Right.
You don't have to prove that. You just say that stuff. See, I want to have sympathy for people or try to get people to go, could you imagine being in that environment? It's pretty heady stuff. We're going to change the world. And all we just go to Mount Everest and we're going to pray, and they're sincere. Right. They are.
But this is the thing. So like, you bring that up.
Into it.
You bring that up. And so Taylor writes, so Becca Greenwood is somebody that you would think, okay, here she was a little younger. She was 30. She was coming along on this. And so you think, to your point about thinking, oh, they must feel so bad or whatever when they see this kind of stuff. But what he writes is, when I interviewed Becca Greenwood, this was years later, she brought up this Operation Ice Castle experience, not with a sense of embarrassment or chagrin about one's youthful misadventures. No, she was proud of her participation, counting it among her greatest achievements in a career of skirmishing with Satan's forces. So there's just something, I feel like I too quickly go to like the DSM-5 to explain what's happening in people's heads, and
What's
but
DSM-5?
To me, that's the manual for diagnosing various mental illnesses and stuff. But it's like, this is what I look at with this entire movement, that I think, like I've said a lot, and you've just mentioned it in this conversation, that I tend to think they're just lying, a lot of them, and trying to make money off of this and amassing power. But I do think that you're right, that for a lot of them, this is just completely real. And I don't know if that's better or worse, but I'm just looking at it, I'm saying, if somebody is that deep into this, that they'll go do this thing on Mount Everest with no metrics for measuring, like, what actually happened in the heavenlies.
Well, she identified it as the greatest thing.
Right. It's like, how you confront that movement, Yeah.
Well, here's what's weird, because we're talking about it now, but when you said that, if I heard somebody, I'm just trying to go back in the day when I was pastoring and kind of like you, kind of gutting it out day by day and dealing with people and helping them find the way. If I heard somebody talk like that, I would not spend 5 minutes trying to convince them they're wrong. I would go, I wouldn't. So why are we talking now? Because it got really big. It's influencing lots of...
It's a movement. It's a movement, and it's a movement that has the ear of the President of the United States. Not that he believes it, but he finds it useful.
And can I say something snippy? I'll be snippy. I don't care about the President of the United States. I care about people who are authentically wanting to follow Jesus in the way of Jesus, who get pulled by the nose because it's sensational and it's wow, and there's enough that's real that they might stay and they give their discernment away. I care about the sheep that get pulled into this.
Yeah.
Donald Trump doesn't make. I expect very little from him relative to anything that sounds remotely close to truth.
Yeah, my issue with it is that it actually, because they have perceived political power now, or I mean real political power, and because they like in the work that I do on my YouTube channel and stuff, I wanted Trump to lose for so many reasons. One of the smaller reasons, but still important, is I knew that if he would lose, then people would stop calling him the Antichrist, and I could stop talking about that. And people would stop talking to, calling him God's chosen, So it's like, those are the two. And by him winning, it's like, it just leaves this open question about, he's God's chosen one, or no, he's the anti. It's like, no, he's a thug from Queens who operates on a mob mentality, is really good at manipulating people. But because now he has won again, and these people say that this proves that God is, got his hand on him and all of this.
Right.
Now this movement has a lot more power with the people that we're trying to care for.
Going all the way back to 2016, I don't know the quote is, but Cindy Jacobs and that group kind of took credit that this was, that they prayed Donald Trump into the White House. And it actually makes sense that in 2020, when Joe Biden was declared the winner, they were actively involved on January 6th, praying against territorial spirits to bring the election back. It didn't work. I'm guessing, like you said, Pat, I'm guessing as they're thinking that now he's back in power. Okay, the prophecies we had were true. It just took some time.
Right. Yeah, right. And so they're looking at it now as though their entire movement has been credited by God, that God has blessed all of this. And it's like, that's powerful. That's why I care about the fact that Donald Trump, associates with them and gives them prominence. It's not that I care about him. I care about the effect that he has.
You're saying actually the same thing I'm saying a different way. Yeah.
Yep. So take us then from, Operation Ice Castle, that sort of thing. The chapter that takes us all the way then to January 6th. And I'm just going to open it up to you. Like, if you want to help people to see how the chapter gets us from point A to point B.
I had a bunch of things written down here that were, that were the dates. But I think the progression was this praying over territorial spirits, believing that Trump had came into the White House supernaturally because of their prayer, and Paula White's in here too, because she I think it was in 2015. It was it was into the Trump administration, like in 2018 or 19. She actually had a job in the White House.
Yeah, she had an office and everything in the White House.
And that became, and she wasn't using the generals of spiritual warfare. There was another term she had.
Yeah. There's always a term.
Was it the USSPN? I wrote a bunch of them down. United States Strategic Prayer Network, the ACPE, the Apostolic Council of Prophetic Elders, the WLI, Wagner Leadership Institute. Every time they'd have any initiative, they'd have a title for it.
There's always a...
But she was really instrumental in pulling a lot of these Cindy Jacobs types together in 2018-19, before the Stop the Steal thing happened. So there was this mobilization of apostles, prophets who thought like this.
An infrastructure.
Getting boots on the ground. So an infrastructure, but still amorphous. A lot of people in the end who embrace this don't identify as NAR. Right. But I hope people can get some sense of how this just kind of grew, like-minded people. And there was some sort of Zoom call where people were listening and praying, like 1 million people praying over Stop the Steal. And we're praying against Nancy Pelosi, who is a demon. And
you don't believe that?
No,
just making this clear for people, in case that gets clipped. And here's Dave Johnson saying,
"You think I'm saying that?" Then
you're not tracking, but
yeah.
But they believe she is. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I hope that explains some of what was going on, and that's why Matthew Taylor's book was. He's we didn't know that. He's kind of helping us see behind the curtain. No, this was coordinated. Intentional. How did Paula White get into that place? A few minutes ago, are we both ADD? You talked about Trump being the Antichrist. I don't even, there's not an Antichrist, but Antichrist, everything that Christ is,
right,
I would
right.
say he is that.
Yeah. I always say it's the article. I will say he's an Antichrist, as
Yeah.
there have been thousands. When you start saying the Antichrist, that's when it's like, no, you've lost me.
It's a
I'm not
weird
going there.
interpretation of
Yeah.
Revelation that's already
Right.
been
Right.
debunked. That's another podcast.
Yeah, it's another podcast. It's one that we should do because I talk about it quite a bit on my channel. It's the biggest disagreement I have with a lot of the people who, follow me. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, one of the other words for the people who, Paula White was pulling together, POTUS shield, President of the United States shield, POTUS shield, Trump's Evangelical Advisory Board, that sort of stuff. So
when he got shot, remember his ear got shot?
Yeah.
That was probably because they were praying for him. But
Right.
if you want to do the Antichrist thing, why are things I heard all my life as a kid not coming up now? Because the Antichrist apparently survived this fatal wound, and that was proof he was the Antichrist. So let's go there.
Right. Yeah. No, I know.
And I'm not going there.
I hear it every day.
I'm just noticing them. They don't see that. Anyway.
Right. So yeah, so then it gets into, so you've got the infrastructure in place then. And then Joe Biden wins the election. So it's like, so now there's this, I don't know if you want to call it a crisis of faith or a mass hysteria or whatever, but what happens is all of these people who thought that that they had these prophecies from God and that God has his hand on Donald Trump, he's the guy, and now he loses. And so then so people hear all these stories about the legal machinations and things that were going on behind the scenes in the Trump administration, but Taylor's book is very helpful because it's talking about the spiritual groups that are going on during this time. And so this chapter, he talks then about the Jericho marches as an example. These and the Jericho, again with shofars, but they're marching and they're mobilizing against this stolen election, and it sort of sets the stage for what ends up happening. Well, why don't you talk about that?
Well, yeah, I think you said it pretty well. The thing that's interesting is that with the Jericho March, I remember seeing a lot of stuff on that. The guy, who's that not conspiracy, the guy, Tony Jones had this.
Oh, yeah. Doug or
Sandy Brook kids. In the Holocaust isn't real.
Jones,
he was one of the guys there, evangelical Christian, Eric Metaxas as well, which was very weird to me.
Talk about a guy whose reputation went from like being normal guy to absolutely crazy, mean guy. Eric Metaxas. Like I read books by him, thought he was a normal guy, and then Trump came along. It's like, I mean, Trump, I think, just revealed who a lot of people are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Alex Jones is who you were trying
Alex
to say.
Jones, yeah. What was I going to say? I forgot. Yeah, and they were, but I remember what it was that I mean, there were some prayers even in the book of Cindy Jacobs on site in January 6th, praying against the spirits that were stealing the election, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
But they were really praying for safety too. They were praying that there would be no violence, that there would be no one would get hurt. So I want to give them that to say they were not promoting violence, but there was a irresponsible is the nicest word I can think of, naivete over their inability to see how all of their rhetoric was violent. Take it by force. Spiritual warfare. We got generals. We're gonna, and so it was. They were watching the violence happening, and it's kind of like Trump himself wants to distance himself from having any responsibility at all for the crowd that went and stormed the Capitol when he said, show up and go get him or whatever. Like, there's something about those words and that whole way of thinking and speaking that is very consistent for them, for other people to take it a step further. Why are you surprised?
Right. Yep. Yeah. And then that gets to the end of this chapter so there's a section called Spiritual Warfare Everywhere, and Matthew Taylor is just writing about this rhetoric of spiritual warfare that's leading towards that last quote that I read at the beginning of this whole talk. And so he's giving some examples. He says, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, a Roman Catholic, has taken to quoting the Ephesians 6 passage about the armor of God, but he'll swap out the phrase the devil for the left. So, quote, our state is worth fighting for. This country is worth fighting for. So put on the full armor of God and take a stand against the left's schemes. I mean, that's, devil. Yeah. I mean, this is not okay. I don't care what side you're on politically. This is not okay, And
I give DeSantis a little bit of room because he's an idiot.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Sorry.
So
you can edit that out too.
No, that's fine. I'm probably going to leave that in. So Steve Bannon is not an idiot. Steve Bannon is a smart guy. And there's a quote here. Yeah, I mean, yeah, he is. And Trump strategist Steve Bannon has called Democratic candidates satanic, pure evil, and someone who hangs with satanic groomers. I mean, like this kind of language is just, and this was before Trump won this last time. I mean, so these people all feel so empowered right now.
Yep. Well, I'm glad you read that, because that is an example of some of the rhetoric that you're responsible. That stirs things up, and you did it on purpose.
Right.
To stir things up.
Yep. And then there's this quote that you just said, Michael Flynn, who was, believe it or not, the national security advisor for 10 days or whatever it was. He says, this is a war that we're in. This is a big time spiritual war. I mean, people like Nancy Pelosi, she's a demon.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like when you use language like that, yeah, like you said, are you surprised that this happens?
Right.
So, yeah.
And it's sad because people believe that just inflames. You become even more. We have to fight for this, and you become untethered from anything that resembles the message of Jesus, the way of Jesus. Like that's lost. And if there's hope, it's that we come back to what it means to follow the way of Jesus in the middle of chaos, in the middle of empire, which is what we are. I think the whole paradigm is screwed up, and we're praying against demons who we think are Democrats to bring Donald Trump, who embodies nothing that resembles Christ. When I think the paradigm for the church right now, if there's hope for the church, and I think there is, the evangelical structure, I'm not sure, but it's that we live in empire. And we need to be like Daniel, who figure out how can we be faithful to God, Yahweh, and live in Babylon. It isn't to make Babylon great; it's to confront Babylon, but also to be a good citizen in Babylon. But man, oh man, I don't know how to bring back people who are thinking making America great. It would be we've talked about this before.
Yeah.
In Jesus' day, when they were saying Hosanna, Hosanna. Make Israel great again. Please be the kind of king who's going to kick the crap out of Rome or the libs. And Jesus wept because he said, even now your eyes are blind to the things that make for peace. You don't get it. And it bothers me. It grieves me that significant parts of the Church of Jesus Christ they are blind to the eyes. Their eyes are blind to the things that make for peace.
Right.
Because it isn't. Yeah.
And just to tie this chapter together, with what we've been talking about here, there's one section where Matthew Taylor kind of lays this out very clearly about what this chapter is about, the core of this chapter, and he's talking about the strategic level spiritual warfare that we've been talking about. But it's helpful that he lays out three kinds of spiritual warfare to contrast it. And the first one is just ground level spiritual warfare, which is, most Christians have some sense that this is something that we do, praying for and casting demons out. Maybe, like, I don't necessarily know that everybody believes in that, but it also might include praying for the unsaved, that God would win the battle for their souls. So it's ground level spiritual warfare. And then there's this occult level spiritual warfare. And so, okay, that starts to get more controversial, but still it's something that's somewhere within the mainstream on some level, but then this strategic level spiritual
warfare. Can I stop on there just on that?
Yeah.
Just to help people know what we're talking about there.
Yeah.
Is at a cult level. When we started, I was talking about this satanic panic.
Yeah.
Some people will remember that back in the day when this stuff was stirring, there were all sorts of things about Ouija boards, and if you do that, you opened up your soul to a demon. There was a lot of accusations of satanic ritualistic abuse.
Right.
A lot of that. I mean, there were people who went to jail. And they were exonerated. There was just no proof. There was just hysteria around that. So I'm sorry.
Yeah, right. So exactly. And then what he's saying is now what this chapter is really focusing about, these generals of spiritual warfare, is this innovation from Cindy Jacobs and Peter Wagner and others of strategic level spiritual warfare, what we've been talking about, praying over, like nations and people just devoting their lives to this war that's happening in the heavenlies. And so the point that Taylor makes at the end of the book is tying this all together, that basically when you've got this strategic level spiritual warfare mentality about praying for entire nations, and then you start bringing in language about your opponents are demonic, your opponents are demons. He says strategic level spiritual warfare layered into already roiling partisan politics, where conservative and right-wing Christians envisage their fellow citizens and often their fellow Christians as literally driven by demons.
Yeah.
He's just saying this is a recipe for disaster. And that's where I'm going to read this final quote again that I started with. This is how the chapter ends. If your political opponents are literally inspired by demons, then there's no negotiating with them. Demons are not meant to be negotiated with. They are meant to be battled, exercised, and expelled. As we saw on January 6th, this rhetoric of spiritual violence stokes real-world violence. You can only proclaim that a group of people or a political party is filled with demons for so long before someone decides that those demonic vessels must actually be physically attacked.
Yep.
And that's how he ends the chapter.
Yep. Sobering. I think he's right. I think he's
right too. So, all right. So next chapter, hopefully we'll get one in this week while you're still, how long are you in Arizona?
Can I tell you something? Our daughter lives out. We went out to dinner with her, and she is as feisty as they come. But I was telling her some about this, and she just gets on me, and she's saying, Dad, you need to go look at videos of puppies and babies. You need to quit all this stuff and just look at puppies and babies.
Right,
and
exactly.
Me, my daughter Drea is not a puppy baby. Anyway.
Yeah, right. No, I have to do that sort of thing, too, because it's like this. I can't do this all day long. So this is sobering stuff. So, All right. So hopefully we'll get one in this week, another conversation here. And thanks, Dave. And thanks everybody for listening.
Thanks, Pat.